There is a headstone in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, that tells a story in 2 lines. The first line reads, Gracie Allen, 1902 to 1964. The second reads, George Burns, 1896 to 1996. She is listed first. He chose that. He had 32 years after her death to change it, and he never did. That small, quiet decision says almost everything about what George Burns spent the last third of his life carrying. A love that had outlasted the act, outlasted the marriage, outlasted even the secret he had buried inside it for decades. This is the full story of what George Burns kept hidden, why he kept it, and what it reveals about one of the most beloved partnerships in the history of American entertainment. Nathan Birnbaum was born on January 20th, 1896, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the 9th of 12 children in a Jewish immigrant family. His father died when he was 7, and the family's poverty became immediately and practically severe. He began performing on street corners and in local saloons as a child, singing in a harmony quartet for whatever coins passersby would drop. By his early teens, he had renamed himself George Burns and was working the vaudeville circuit, the grinding network of traveling variety shows that served as the only path to professional entertainment for a working-class kid with no formal training and no connections. He was not, by his own honest admission, a particularly remarkable performer in those years. He could hold a stage, tell a joke, and keep an audience from walking out, but he had not yet found what he was supposed to be. Gracie Allen was born on July 26, 1902, in San Francisco, the daughter of Irish Catholic parents who were themselves performers. She grew up around show business, started in vaudeville as a child, and by the time she was a teenager had developed a performance instinct that was entirely her own, a way of delivering lines that made the most absurd logic sound, in the moment of delivery, completely sensible. She and George met in 1922 when both were working the vaudeville circuit, and they began performing together almost immediately. The original arrangement cast George as the comedian and Gracie as the straight man. The audiences had a different opinion. They laughed at Gracie. They watched Gracie. They remembered Gracie. George noticed this with a clarity that he has described in interviews as being less like humility and more like simple math. He was in the business of making audiences laugh, and the audiences were laughing at her. So he handed her the funny lines, repositioned himself as her foil, and watched everything change. The act became Burns and Allen. What made them genuinely extraordinary, what separated them from the dozens of comedy duos working the same circuit at the same time, was the specific texture of Gracie's comic logic. She did not play stupid. She played a woman whose reasoning was internally consistent, but operated from a set of assumptions that bore no relation to common sense. George would set up a question, and Gracie would answer it with complete confidence in a direction nobody had anticipated. The joke was never on Gracie. The joke was on the world for not keeping up with her. Audiences adored her for it, and they kept adoring her across every medium the entertainment industry moved through. Burns and Allen went from vaudeville to radio in 1929, became one of the most listened to programs in America through the 1930s and 1940s, moved to film, and then made the transition to television in 1950 with the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show, which ran for 8 seasons and drew millions of viewers every week. Most acts collapsed when their medium changed. Burns and Allen rebuilt themselves each time without losing a single step. They had married in January 1926, for years after they began performing together, and the marriage and the act became so intertwined that separating them was difficult even for the people inside it. George handled the writing, the business decisions, the structural architecture of how the act was built and maintained. Gracie brought the quality that no amount of writing or business sense could manufacture. The spark, the specific and unrepeatable personality that made everything else work. He joked in later years that his real talent had been marrying her. There was more truth in that joke than he usually let on. But marriages are not acts, and even the most beloved partnerships carry private weight that the public never sees. George Burns carried a secret inside his marriage to Gracie Allen for the entirety of their time together and for 32 years after she was gone. The secret was not complicated. During their marriage, he had been unfaithful. A single affair, brief and apparently self-contained, that he later discussed with a bluntness that characterized his public persona in old age. The discovery, when it came, arrived through one of the most ordinary and humiliating routes imaginable. A piece of evidence was found by a household employee and placed where Gracie would encounter it. George knew she had found it. He knew that she understood what it meant. He also understood, in the silence that followed, that Gracie had made a decision. She chose not to speak of it directly. She accepted the gifts he brought her, a silver centerpiece she had wanted, a piece of expensive jewelry, and the subject closed between them without ever being formally addressed. They never discussed it again. Not once in the decades that followed. George Burns spent the rest of his marriage and the rest of his life living alongside a wound that had been sealed but never fully healed, and the seal was made entirely of silence. That silence was, in its own way, a portrait of Gracie Allen's character. The woman audiences knew as sunny, scatterbrained, and blissfully disconnected from ordinary logic was, in private, a deeply thoughtful and emotionally sophisticated person. She had performed since childhood and was, by the account of everyone who knew her off-camera, intelligent, reserved, and more anxious than anything she ever showed on screen. The red light on a live television camera, the light that indicated the camera was transmitting, reportedly made her so nervous that she eventually asked for it to be switched off during recordings. Millions of people watched her as the definition of effortless ease, and she delivered that ease while managing a private anxiety that never fully went away. By the mid-1950s, her health had begun to reflect the accumulated cost of decades of performing under that kind of internal pressure. She developed serious heart problems, suffered from debilitating migraines, and carried a fatigue that had been building for years. In 1958, she retired. George tried to continue performing without her. The act had always required two people, and the absence of one of them was immediately and unmistakably felt. Gracie Allen died on August 27, 1964, of a sudden heart attack. She was 69 years old. George was downstairs working on material when she died upstairs. The partnership that had defined his entire adult life, the voice he had written for, the timing he had built his own around, the woman who had made everything work, was simply gone. At the funeral, he had to be held up by his son and by his closest friend, Jack Benny. The man who had made America laugh for 40 years could not stand without support at his wife's graveside. In the months that followed, he could not sleep in their shared bedroom. He eventually moved into her bed because the familiar environment helped. That detail, the practical, quietly devastating act of sleeping in a dead woman's bed because it was the only thing that eased the insomnia, communicates the depth of the loss more directly than any tribute he ever gave to her publicly. He went back to work because work was the only thing he knew how to do with grief. He performed, toured, produced, and kept telling jokes with the cigar and the raised eyebrow that audiences had always associated with him. The late career breakthrough came in 1975 when he replaced Jack Benny, who had died that year in The Sunshine Boys, winning the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor at the age of 79 and becoming the oldest person to win a competitive Oscar at that time. He told interviewers that he had asked Gracie to put in a good word for him before the nominations came out. The line got a laugh every time. It was also almost certainly something close to what he actually did. He visited her grave regularly and spoke to her there. He wore the same style of suit he had always worn because Gracie had liked it. He kept her photograph where he could see it. He told stories about her in interviews for 32 years with the same combination of pride and precise comic timing that had characterized everything they had ever done together, and underneath all of it was the admission he finally made late in life. That he had once hurt her, that she had known, that she had chosen to stay, and that the grace with which she had handled that moment was, in the end, the most Gracie thing she had ever done. When George Burns died on March 9, 1996, just 49 days after his 100th birthday, which he had celebrated with a performance at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, he was buried beside her at Forest Lawn. He had made the arrangements years in advance, specifying exactly how the headstone should read. Her name first, his name beneath. The same order he had given her top billing in their act after he realized, somewhere in a vaudeville house in the 1920s, that she was the one the audience was there to see. Together again. That is what the stone says at the bottom. He had waited 32 years to get back there, and he spent every one of those years making sure nobody forgot who she was. That, in the end, is the real secret George Burns kept, not the affair which he eventually told. The secret was how completely he had loved her, past the hurt he had caused, past the silence they had kept, past her death and his grief, and 32 years of going on without her.